set auto-destruct sequence.
It's the time allotted that concerns me.
Recognize Picard, Jean-Luc, Captain. Recognize Riker, William T, Commander.
Maximum warp.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I'm UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Fert Derby and Lord Uther. Gentlemen, welcome back to that galaxy that we are exploring with the next-gen crew of Star Trek. And is there an intro that I could give to the last Outpost that would really describe what we see unfold here in accurate terms? I'm not sure. The first episode ever featuring the Ferengi species of alien, and there's some things going on. So, Fert Derby, let me ask you, before we get into the meat and potatoes of this, if I told you that Armin Shimmerman was in this episode of Star Trek, and one, it's not his first, but two, it is his first that got broadcast, and it features Ferengi, what are you expecting?
Something different. I spent most of this episode trying to find Armin Shimmerman. It was kind of like a weird, where in the world is Armin Shimmerman motif, because he does not play our lead Ferengi in this episode. So I think I'll have to gird myself and try again to see if I can say, oh, that's definitely him. That is definitely who will become Quark, the bartender, on our next Star Trek voyage that we'll be doing as we move along with the next gen crew, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Stay tuned, Warp Core fans. The ride is just getting underway. But before we can get to DS9 and Quark and all of those things, we do have to talk about The Last Outpost, which aired on October 19th, 1987. And I am proud and somewhat humbled to say that no one was fired during the production of this episode, despite whatever your feelings may be. That's an unfair blow to our director, Richard Kalla, who actually has science fiction street cred. He directed the original 148-minute-long network pilot of Battlestar Galactica in 1978. So we would not have Cylons, Colonial Vipers, Adama, Boxy, Starbuck, Apollo, Baltar, the Imperious Leader, all of those things, Caprica, without the steady helmsmanship of Richard Kalla. He also worked later in his career on Miami Vice and Hunter with Fred Dreyer. So he knew his way around TV. So we can't really say that he wasn't quite sure what footing he was on. The writing credits, the story was by Richard Kremesian, and the teleplay was by Herbert Wright. And as the teleplay writer for this episode, Herbert is credited as the father of the Ferengi. And he also, in his spare time, he held a black belt in Japanese sword. So he could write a Star Trek episode, and he could beat you up in an alley if he so chose to, and steal your wallet. So Herbert was instructed by Gene Roddenberry. His edict when the show opened was, I don't want audiences to just get Vulcans and Romulans and Klingons. And save for a certain security officer right now that's on the bridge that we're trying to find things to do, we don't have any Vulcans and we don't have any Romulans. Instead, we have the Ferengi, who are supposed to be the next super alien opponent villain for the next gen crew. They were actually name checked in Encounter at Farpoint. The suggestion that they eat their victims or their prey. So we had sort of an off-screen cannibal suggestion. And of course, they do have big teeth. But thankfully, no Ferengi or human were harmed during this episode. And we did have Armin Shimmerman, as we said, who would become a pivotal Star Trek fixture, both on screen and at conventions. This was also his first on-screen appearance. He actually plays a different role in another episode, but that had not yet aired because they shoot these things not necessarily in order production-wise. It's all based on sets and schedules and everything else. So, but this is the first time we are glimpsing Mr. Shimmerman, and not to be the last. Gentlemen, I'm going to leave it up to you to guide us in the Ferengi direction. I will say, for my own brief notes, separate of that, this is probably the first time I've heard a French swear word in television at this time. Breaking new ground, Star Trek, with a muttered merde from Captain Picard. So love that. There's also a discussion of the French flag and the colors of blue, white, and red, which also dovetails with an Uncle Sam sort of running gag that they do on the bridge. I'm having a hard time figuring out whose responsibility on the bridge is to open hailing frequencies. Is it Tasha Yar? Is it Lieutenant Data? Because they both seem to share that. And I would think that Starfleet would probably have pretty strict guidelines as to whose portfolio includes opening hailing frequencies. I don't mind, but it just felt like they were kind of, no, you get this one. No, it's your turn. No. And, I have call waiting. So I thought the hailing frequencies thing was there. This is also our first glimpse of Riker and LaForge in engineering, and this will play a factor because right now, who is running that ship down there, as Lord Uther points out? Who is our chief engineer? It seems to change at the drop of a hat, but they liked what they saw with LeVar Burton down there, and he and Riker sort of puzzling out how to free the Enterprise from sort of a force field shield restraint. So they took notes. The producers took notes, and that would eventually bear fruit, as we said. But it was nice to see him not just sitting at the bridge, moving them up to warp factor 4. Yeah, when we do our warp cores, I'll go into further criticism or some notes. But gentlemen, going back to the Ferengi question, again, this is a big Star Trek race. We're going to see a ton of them in future installments of 2 or 3 different points in the franchise. But you tell me, how do we feel about? Are these guys better than the Klingons?
They're goofy, I think is the best way to put it, and I like it because it's a bit of a sleeper. And I love that you brought up Farpoint, because there's sort of this idea, like with the original series, like nobody's ever seen them, nobody's ever seen a Romulan, we don't know what they look like, and then you find out, oh, they look like Vulcans. Nobody's ever seen a Ferengi. We don't know much about them. Do they eat their victims? It's that unknown quantity of a new race or a new species that it is kind of a human aspect. And for the first time, you kind of get that, I don't know, that sort of ignorance from the Starfleet people who are like, boy, I don't know about this. And then you discover it and they're like, oh gosh, boy, were we wrong. They're just goofy. And it colors how, one, they're portrayed in future episodes, but two, it kind of makes them really unique in the best way. Even though in this episode, I mean, they move around like monkeys, they're kind of dumb and dim-witted and obviously, habitual liars, and primitive, really. But, it overshadows the fact that they're just sort of reconning a godlike being, which is just so lazy, so lazy. But it also introduces the concept of these ancient peoples that were super, super advanced, that comes up again and again as a trope in Next Gen that tends to be really interesting. I mean, really, really interesting. And what I like about the Ferengi in this case is that they're always kind of a vessel of discovery in all 3 phases of the Next Generation, whether it's Voyager, DS9, or Next Gen. They're always kind of involved in some kind of unique discovery situation, as far as pushing the limits of this quadrant of the galaxy, or a new quadrant of the galaxy as in DS9. It's not a great episode, but it is definitely something that gives you another new race that you know is going to recur and is going to evolve. You see some of these one-off races like the Ligonians in the last episode. We never see them again. I was actually a little surprised. Maybe they came up in lower decks, but I was a little surprised that they weren't like foisted into the lower decks, lexicon, because that would have been a funny second contact episode. But I love that they kind of give them all of the characterizations that we see later. They're covetous, they are scavengers in a way. They're seeking out profit. I really enjoy the Ferengi, and it's not because of this episode, but like with a lot of these early episodes, you see that foundation being built out where I know I'm going to come to appreciate all of these things that are showing up here, and it really feels like the writers kind of took a fistful of freshly cooked spaghetti and threw it against the wall to see what would stick. And what they got, it was odd. It was very, very odd, but I enjoyed it. I will say, in spite of its goofiness, I did enjoy myself.
Yeah, they're obviously just trying to establish, a new race or a new character, which I get it. I just think they're supposed to be like the comical, to me at least, it seemed like the comic relief type of enemy that stumbles over each other, kind of like Mud. Was that his name? Yeah. Kind of like that, right? Not completely serious, but still a threat in a sense, or the mischievousness could mess things up. I do like that Riker and LaForge tried to come up with a way to break away, and they couldn't. So I like when those things fail sometimes, just to kind of show you can't get out of every situation in a sense. So I liked almost a preview of that, and just the struggle to figure out what everyone does. And I know that's going to be a continuous theme throughout the first season, which, again, I get it. Why ditch the communications officer? I've kind of been trying to figure that one out, right, going from the original series to this. Did they see it as just a mundane position, and now we'll just try and hand it off to someone else? Not even a slight explanation of maybe it becomes part of ops now. That's what they're supposed to do. But then they replace that position with the counselor position, which, by the way, I'm going to talk about that with the next episode. There's something that happens at the end that was just odd, because they're still trying to figure that out too. Like they put Troy on the ship, but what are we really going to do with her? Maybe that's what, at least with Uhura, I felt like there was more purpose. So, been trying to figure that one out too. But this episode was okay for me. We come up against a godlike being, a little more original series feeling there. That they could just hold this starship in orbit. All we needed was a glowing hand to just hold the Enterprise and the Ferengi ship just like that. And it would have been a original series episode. So those are my thoughts on it. To me, a very forgettable episode, except for the point of, again, getting the Ferengi, and we're going to see them later on. It's going to get fleshed out some more. But look, I think that's an important point, too. We're going to get some redemption with the Ferengi later on. We're also going to get some Tasha Yar redemption a couple seasons down the road, where her presence was needed for, in my opinion, one of the best episodes, or at least two-parters of Next Gen that, to me, that's out there, right? But they needed her for that. Anyway, or she comes into play at some point. Spoiler alert, 30 years later.
Yeah. um, I'm. I think there's episode is a split screen. I think the first half with an alien race we're not familiar with, and that we think that they have knocked out the Enterprise's ability to function, and then we find the surprise that they think the Enterprise has knocked them out of function. That's such a tremendous setup. The first half of this episode is solid gold platinum, or pressed latinum. But the second half, as we go planet side, indulges in some of the worst original series. You say to yourself, well, I'm sure special effects have improved in 1987, and they have. They just didn't on this planet. The long panning shot of Riker looking out at this alien world, even enhanced with digital effects from Paramount Plus and so forth, man, that was, I started to giggle because I just thought this just doesn't in any sense of the imagination look authentic in any possible way. Like, I just am not buying this planet, even by adding lightning effects to it. We're back to cat's paw. And then it didn't get any better once they were running around and everyone, like, Geordi's upside down and Data's like on these rock, like, the whole thing just reeked of 1969 production values season 3, when they didn't even finish building the western town for the Earp brothers or whatever that was. I'm still trying to remember that there, where Wyatt Earp was suddenly the villain. So that's what sank this episode in this quarters here. And then I love the idea of, Riker using his wits to figure out the riddle for this godlike being, but it just seems like it came rather easily. Like, the guy, I'll rush at him, and Will Riker shows a spine of steel and doesn't flinch. Oh, okay, you're great. Here, let's come over here. Let's talk. How have you been? What have I missed? I've been in, stasis for
Well, it's
thousands
very
of-
Kirkish,
Right.
right?
Right.
There's
Yeah.
your Kirk element.
Right. But it just felt like the writers, like I say, we got to the end of the episode, like, well, we got to solve this somehow. Oh, quick. Now he and Riker are thick as thieves, and the Ferengi are, dancing around on the rocks, dancing Ferengi. It was just odd. And then they didn't have Will Wheaton in this episode, right? And I think that paradoxically, that not having him even for one scene with his mom, I think undercut some of the jeopardy I was supposed to feel as they're upstairs on the ship freezing to death. Because I would have thought, especially mother, son, and so forth, she might have Wesley, put a blanket over him and give him a kiss on the forehead and say, it's going to be okay. He's telling his mom, reassuring her mom, they'll figure it out. The away team, Riker will never fail. Like, it needed that moment, because I didn't really feel like the sense that they were, we might die. And in the end, when they are rescued and the heat turns back on, like, Beverly's up on the bridge in Riker's chair next to Picard, and well, where's the boy? He's downstairs. I mean, it's just one of those things where I know, whatever Will Wheaton's contract was and so forth, we had people miss episodes in the original series. But if you're going to do a subplot where basically everyone, all the families and the children and the non-essential personnel are threatened with extinction, I just feel like as a writer, I would have tried to have the mother-son, little bond there. It did not have to be a 5-minute scene, but considering that they are fairly close as presented later in the show, it just felt like an odd moment to not have, we'll be okay. Or close your eyes.
Who would have thought you'd ever ask, where is Will Wheaton?
Exactly. So those are my thoughts there.
I'll go first. I'm going to give this one 2 out of 7, and here's why. Number one, literally because of the 2 points I'm going to bring up. We get the Beverly Picard. Is there a little bit of love there on the bridge? Like, we established that. I feel like we established that finally. The way she kind of, because if I remember correctly, she kind of almost brushes his cheek or does something, looks at him affectionately. So I feel like we get the first piece of that. And here's what saves the entire episode and doesn't make it as bad as the alternative factor is Data. His comic relief totally saves this episode when he's got the
Chinese finger trap.
yes, and can't get out of it. And then I like the tribute to Trouble with Tribbles when they send or they beam over all those toys over to the Ferengi ship. I did like the nod to that, so maybe it gets a 2.5 out of 7 warp cores for me. But those two things, again, in hindsight, retrospectively, give me give me hope.
I'll keep it quick, Ursa. I'm right there. I'm a deuce. This one is a 2. It treads dangerously close to some of the worst impulses of the original series, but again, I can't not like this crew. I just can't. I'm just, it doesn't matter what you're going to put them in. I turned off this episode and I wanted to watch the next one. A, because I hoped it would be better, and B, just because I have a crush on the Enterprise D, and I really want to see where they boldly go.
I'm right there dialed in. 2 out of 7 warp cores for me as well. And the comic relief with Data is just, it's so understated that it almost redeems this episode, but not quite. And then, yes, the reference to Trouble with Tribbles right at the end, and you get kind of that, it is a bit of a Desilu finish where they're kind of like at the end. But it plays well. I think it's those little things that made this episode palatable when it could have easily just been one that was lost to the tropes. So 2 out of 7 warp cores, but there is more Trek to come with this Enterprise D and this crew set in the 24th century. We will be back next time. And until then, subscribe, like, share, comment, make it so.